Hi, welcome to the fourth block of the course. We're continuing to level up in matchmoving. Let's load up the shot. Import the cache. And watch it. How do we deal with this? What we're looking at is a panning camera movement with minimal parallax. And the problem with tracking in shots like this is that it's very hard to determine the depth of the scene. Depth, meaning how close or far the tracked points are from the camera, is usually derived from parallax when we track near, mid and far objects and observe how they move in relation to each other. But here, it's just a camera pan. The camera is either mounted on a tripod or handheld without changing position. As a result, closer objects don't shift in relation to the background. In other words, there's almost no parallax. So, how do we overcome this? Now, in general, if we don't need any depth, we can simply switch the camera to fixed camera position constraint mode. Track a couple of points, and that will be enough to determine the camera's rotation. Let's do that. Here the track breaks because the pattern it's trying to match has changed. We've got motion blur now, so we can set a new keyframe and continue tracking from this point. The footage isn't the best quality, but that only makes it more interesting to work with. If the crosshair in the center bothers you, you can turn it off in the View, Show Field of View settings. Whoop. I'm expanding the vertical search area because in this shot the camera moves from bottom to top. If we leave the default search zone, the track will just break. Also, since this is a no parallax shot, we can safely disable scale reference pattern so the pattern always searches only within this area. We know for sure it won't move closer or farther and won't parallax. We can probably turn off rotate as well because the camera only rotates on one axis. And we can see the track runs much smoother this way. And this is the point we'll track to. It stopped here because the search area is too small. Let's expand it and everything will run smoothly. For the fixed camera position constraint motion type, 2 points are enough. We created 3, but the third one breaks, so we need exactly 2 that go through the whole shot without any gaps. Let's calculate. There is camera movement. Here's its rotation. For now we haven't set any camera parameters or lens parameters. That's fine, we'll set them now. I just want to show that with this approach 1 or 2 points are enough. One gives us tilt on one axis, the other on the second. The shot has no depth and it's solved just fine. If we switch to the 3D orientation controls mode, we'll see the points have no depth. They're all at the same distance from the camera. What do we do next? We'll try to recover the shot's depth after all, figure out the layout of the objects and assign them real distances. We remove the camera position constraint and switch to no constraint, so no axes are locked now. Right away we see the timeline panel turn red. The program is telling us there aren't enough trackers anymore. And if we try to solve the camera in this state, 3DE will immediately say no, because it doesn't have enough points to build the root frames or even start the solve. We need to add more trackers. We'll make around 6 trackers. At about 4, the red zone already disappeared, which means if there are roughly 6 points between the root frames, that's enough for the rest of the solve. But it's better to go through the whole shot and place at least 6 points in every section. Here the tracker slips. Let's try tracking it forward and backward. We set a keyframe at the end and track in both directions. Let's make sure we're on the same spot. I'm using such a large pattern area because there's a white spot here, and the tracker will almost certainly get lost. In this zone, it'll just slide along the board left and right, so it's better to pick a patch with a more unique texture. And since this is a shot with very little parallax, this approach is acceptable. But if the camera were shifting even slightly to the side, it would be absolutely unacceptable to include any other plane in the pattern besides the one we're tracking. All of this comes from the specifics of the shot, and you can't ignore things like that. Stop. There was a slip somewhere at the beginning. Yes, here it is. This is what I was talking about. It loses the unique pattern and decides this spot is a match. First, we can press Align to Key. And then we move on to the next spot where we had a slip. And we make the correction. So we have 6 trackers. We can solve the camera again. Before the previous solve, we didn't set the camera and lens parameters. So let's do that now. And this time we'll do it the way we learned in the last lesson, by loading the grids. To start with, I know my sensor width is 22.3 millimeters. And I know that the pixel aspect here is 1. Let's assume we don't know the focal length, and I'll show you how to calculate it using the grid. We add a couple of reference cameras and load the grids into them. I have that one. And I've got this grid. The second grid isn't very good in terms of focus, but it will help us calculate the focal length. We won't use the defocused area here, but we'll use the cell perspective to calculate the focal length. Let's start with the regular grid. We switch to distortion grid controls. We press Smart Reset. This pins 3 points to the corner of one cell. Then we press Snap. Then we expand the grid across the whole frame, using Control and the arrow keys. Done. This is a pretty well shot grid. It's almost perpendicular to the camera, and that's enough to understand how the lens distorts the edges of the frame, but we also need the focal length. We can calculate it using the grid that was shot at an angle where the perspective is visible. It's the perspective that lets us determine the focal length. The principle is the same. We use the cells. This grid wasn't shot as well, but I think we'll sort it out. We press Snap. We don't touch the areas that are out of focus. This grid isn't for distortion, it's for perspective, so we don't use it entirely. We select the safest area. Here it's already out of focus, so that won't work. And above, the defocus starts too, so we take only the part of the grid that's actually in focus. We'll watch how the focal length changes. We can first solve the camera before that. And here's how the points are scattered. Obviously that's not how it really is at all. This is due to the specific camera move in the shot, and it all comes down to the lack of parallax. And also because the focal length is wrong, so let's calculate it. Calc distortion camera geometry. Here we also select the second grid and tell it to solve both the distortion and the focal length based on both grids. We select focal length as a parameter to solve and run the calculation. We apply the parameters and close the window. The focal length came out at around 17 millimeters. That's pretty close to the truth. The rest we can tweak. Overall, everything is fine. The result is almost correct. There's one practical detail. When we enter the lens's focal length, we still have to adjust it a bit because there are always small inaccuracies, but that's just normal workflow. Everything is based on tolerances. Let's solve the camera one more time. Now things are at least spread out in some reasonable way. Let's apply this result and switch to 3D rotation controls. What can we understand based on what we see? First, we can Alt-select some points and check whether they ended up where they should be in 3D space. We select a point, switch to lineup, and see what it actually is. For example, in lineup it shows up as the farthest one, but from the image it's clearly not. The other points also aren't distributed very well in terms of distance from the camera. And overall, the scene scale considering that one cell is 10 centimeters, looks pretty strange. Setting the scale here is the easiest part, but it won't fix the scene itself. Let's add a couple more trackers and move on. We've added a couple of trackers, so let's solve the camera with them. It still looks like a bit of a mess, but let's take a look. Even though we're adding trackers, it still barely helps with determining the depth. We know that the larger the crosshair on a tracker, the closer the 3D point should be to the camera. But here we get the opposite. The point on the chair appears farther from the camera than the point on this corner. And the point on the fridge corner looks a bit closer than the point on the countertop corner. All of this is, again, a result of the lack of parallax. And no matter how we set the scene scale, it still doesn't help determine the depth. Let's move on and break down the ways we can solve this problem.